drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Pardo, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Do you want to start off by just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what type of researcher you are? You're a little deviant from the average person I have on here because you have an interesting and probably underappreciated field for a lot of the people in my audience. But what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a biologist. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I have a PhD in animal behavior, also from Cornell University. Most of my work focuses on animal communication and cognition, as well as using animal sounds as a tool for conservation. I'm also an outspoken advocate for animal rights, for an end to the exploitation of animals in agriculture and other realms, largely because of my knowledge about animal cognition and, sort of the overwhelming evidence that many animals are highly sentient individuals with complex internal lives. I also have a very fledgling YouTube channel and Instagram account, both of which are called Inside Animal Minds, where I post videos about animal communication and cognition and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And at least a big component of what you do is field research, right? So you're not a bench scientist mixing things together in test tubes. You're out in the field in places like Africa.
So I recently in my previous postdoc, I did some work with African elephants, which I hope to go back to at some point in the near future. So I spent a good amount of time out in Kenya following elephants around.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I was interested to talk to you is because I saw some of the research you had done on animal communication, in particular some of the work you'd done recently on elephants. And a longstanding interest of mine has always been the development and the evolution of language and vocal communication more broadly, and how those things tie together. To what extent is communication, that we see in songbirds and other mammalian species, cetaceans, elephants, to what extent is that language like, or sort of like a primordial version of human language, and what can comparative biology in looking cross species tell us about the origins of language in humans? Let's maybe start here very high level from your perspective as an animal biologist and as a field researcher. What I'll keep this sort of intentionally vague and let you kind of take it where you will, but what is human language in contrast to the more widespread forms of vocal communication we see among other species?
It's a really good question. And if you ask different experts, you'll get different answers to that, because the truth is that the way we define language is not universally agreed upon. And often people use that term without having a clear definition for it, which I think sometimes leads to a lot of confusion. So if you ask a linguist, and I have talked to some linguists about this, how would you define language? Often they don't give you an actual definition. What they give you is a list of characteristics that typify human language. But those characteristics, it's not clear if all of those characteristics are necessary for something to be a language, or if they just happen to be the features that are shared in common by all human languages.
Right.
And so, there's in linguistics especially, but also in biology, there's a very clear distinction between language and other forms of communication, but it's not always clear what that distinction is. And so personally, I would define language, as opposed to other forms of communication, as a system of communication that can be used to communicate about virtually any topic, including abstract ideas and things that are removed from the from the present moment in space or time.
Yes. And I think
so that's kind of my working definition, but not
Yeah.
everybody would necessarily agree with that.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely one of those things where, everyone's got a different definition. And also, if we think about this as population biologists, for example, instead of getting stuck in the trap of thinking language must have this pre-specified set of things and everything either does or does not completely conform to that, just like anything else in biology, if we think about species concepts or what is or is not, say, a mammal, there are things that are going to generally be true, that generally sort of fit all the criteria or most of them, but there's always exceptions on the margins to things.
Right.
And I think that's important to keep in mind. But I want to really focus on what you said about a core aspect of language, in my view, from talking to people on the podcast and doing my own reading, is that it requires symbolic cognition, and the use of symbols is where the sort of infinite or unlimited capacity of language comes from, because it allows something to stand in for anything, right? So the whole point of symbolic cognition underlying language is that your name is Michael, and I associate you with the name Michael, but I could just as easily use any other sort of word or vocal sound. I could call you Peter or Paul or some sound I've never even heard before, and I would still be able to communicate with you just as I am now, knowing that your name is Michael or Mickey.
Right.
And so there's this arbitrary quality that symbols allow that sort of unlocks this communicate about anything potential, which is much more unlimited than the scope of vocal communication we see in other animals. Is that roughly how you see it?
Yeah, for the most part, that's true. I think there's a really interesting field of research that is trying to probe exactly to what degree is language uniquely human? Is it entirely uniquely human? Is it sort of a saltatory leap in evolution from all other animals? That's a recent innovation in our lineage, or is it something that has evolved more gradually and there's a lot more features of it that are shared with other species, and potentially even, I mean, frankly, we don't know for sure that there are no other species on Earth without language.
Yeah,
like it's there's a lot of animals, especially cetaceans, which have very large and complex brains, where we barely studied their communication systems at all.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be open to the possibility that we may discover actual language in another species, which would be really fascinating.
Yeah.
But there's no evidence for that currently.
Yeah, I think two related things that come up here for me are, on the one hand, the species that are living today that we know about on Earth are oftentimes understudied. So cetaceans clearly have complex communication, and it remains to be determined exactly how complex and sophisticated it is, simply because it's so hard for us to really study it in depth. Maybe it's language-like, maybe it's not. That's an open question. But another thing that's even easier to forget, in my opinion, is that most of the species that have ever existed and communicated aren't with us anymore. So there could be more gradations in terms of the types of communication and language-like communication that have been around historically. It's just that they were being used by a now extinct species that we don't have access to. And so while it can seem like there's this discontinuous leap between humans and other species, we might be being deceived by the extinction of species that had more intermediate forms of communication.
Especially since we're now the only species of hominid that's left.
Yeah,
right?
When there used to be probably dozens.
Yeah. Right. I mean, unless you can, some people would argue that like the division between hominidae and pongidae, like, hominidae being humans and pongidae being the other great apes, is sort of an artificial one that phylogenetically we ought to be considered a single family. But when I say hominids, I mean like, more recent human cousins.
Right. Australopithecus and Homo. And this is always a question we think about comparative biology, right? It's the lumper versus splitter debates. And because evolution is a continuous process, there's never going to be an ultimate final answer to where some of these dividing lines get put.
Yeah.
So anyways, going back to this idea that, so to the extent that something is language-like, when we're thinking about vocal or auditory communication in other animals, one of the properties that is a core part of language is like my ability to name something, to come up with either a novel name for something or to use names in an arbitrary or semi-arbitrary fashion. So going back to the literal question of names, we mentioned before, like your name is Michael. I know I could call you Mickey. Your name could have been any number of other things, but in one shot, I learned what your name is, and now I can use it. I know the names of a bunch of other people, and I have these unique symbols, these unique vocalizations that I associate, or semi-unique, that I associate it with different people, and I can call them by their name. Do any other species do any kind of naming like that?
Yeah. So actually, the some of the work that I did with African elephants was a study where we were explicitly trying to test if elephants have something like personal names they use to address each other, and we found evidence that they do, and published that. But we weren't the first study to investigate that kind of thing in non-human animals. So I think probably the species where there's the best evidence for it is in bottlenose dolphins. They have signature whistles, which are basically a highly stereotyped, so very consistent and distinct whistle pattern that each individual develops when they're young, and they use that as their calling card. Like usually they produce their own signature whistle to announce their presence to others, but every once in a while, a dolphin will imitate somebody else's signature whistle to effectively call them by name, right, to get their attention and refer to them. And so it's best understood in bottlenose dolphins because that's where it's been best studied. But there's also some evidence for similar behavior in some species of parrots. Whether that is analogous to a name or whether it's something slightly different kind of depends on which parrot researchers you ask. But regardless, everybody agrees that some parrots will imitate each other's calls as a method of addressing them. And then shortly after our elephant study came out, a few months later, another study showing something very similar in common marmosets was published as well. So now we have evidence for this kind of behavior in dolphins, parrots, African savanna elephants, and common marmosets.
Mm-hmm. And so I mean, clearly there are many species of animals where individuals are recognized by other individuals. They can right. learn that you're one individual versus another. They remember you. They treat individuals differently from one another based on their behavioral characteristics or their personality, so to speak. What you're talking about is then this additional ability to actually vocalize in a way that either, I would either announce my presence as an individual. If I was a dolphin, say I have this unique whistle and I can effectively say, I'm here, not someone else, I am here. And then you're saying that in these other species, other members can imitate the sound that said individual makes to identify them. To what extent is that a name? What's important here in terms of the dependency on imitation here?
So in human language, there's this concept called like arbitrariness versus iconicity. Yeah. So most symbols in human language, especially in spoken human languages, this is less true in signed languages, but even in signed languages, it's true to a large extent, that symbols are essentially arbitrary. There's no inherent connection between the sound of a word and the thing that word refers to. And that's important because it allows us to communicate about things that don't make any imitable sound. Like if there's no sound that can be imitated that a thing makes, or no sound that's obviously connected to it in any way.
We can talk about empty space.
Yeah. Right. Like how do you like make the sound of a rock to refer to it in an iconic way?
Right.
You can't, right? So we need arbitrary symbols in order to communicate about a wider range of objects.
Yes.
Now in the dolphin system, whether or not that system is arbitrary kind of depends on what angle you look at it from. So from the perspective of the individual making their own signature whistle to identify themselves to others, that is unquestionably an arbitrary symbol, right? If we accept that it's a symbol, it's unquestionably arbitrary because their whistle is not something that they're born with. They have to invent it. They create their own whistle by listening to the whistles of other individuals around them and kind of combining them together and modifying it in some way. And so that's an arbitrary identifier for themselves. But then when you think about other individuals calling someone by name, by imitating their signature whistle, then it's a little bit debatable whether that's arbitrary or iconic, because maybe they're perceiving this as an arbitrary label that they're using to identify the other dolphin, but maybe they're just, or I shouldn't say just, but maybe what they're doing is essentially labeling another dolphin or naming them by imitating the sound that is most often associated with that dolphin.
Yes. So I guess, one way to start to think about this would be, if I needed to hear you say your first name, in order to know your first name versus, the way I actually learned it. I read it on a page. I didn't hear anyone else say it. I didn't need you to be present or hear you to know what your name is. I guess that hasn't been disproven in dolphins, I would suppose. It's just really hard to know if that is what's going on in cognitive terms, because you probably don't have a situation where you can observe dolphins and one of them is like deaf and the other ones have the opportunity to like make up a name for that third dolphin and then teach someone else about it.
Yeah, right. So we don't. So I think it's not. I think both in the case of humans and in the case of dolphins, if we take writing out of the picture, because writing is, only something that a handful of human languages have done throughout history. And even today, many languages are not really written. So like, generally speaking, for humans, we need to hear somebody's name, either from the speaker, from the owner of the name, or from somebody else in order to learn it. And the same is true for dolphins too. I guess the potential point of distinction here is how often is the name said by the owner? Like, is it,
yes,
we don't say our own names that often. So it's not really something that we could say is the typical sound that we make. Whereas with dolphins, they make their own signature whistles so often that it could be seen as like the typical sound associated with that individual.
Yes.
Same way that, like, instead of saying the word bee, like I might just make a buzzing noise.
Right. Yes, I guess.
But we're doing it by imitating the sound that the bee makes.
Yeah. So the mystery and the potential thing here that's unknown to us as researchers is, so these dolphins are making a characteristic sound that's characteristic of themselves that they invented. They're making it frequently. And so the question is the sound they make, the auditory stimulus that is the sound, it's always associated with, say, the visual presence of the thing. Is this what we would call a simple sensory association, the sound that individual makes plus I see them, so it's like a visual auditory association? Or is it something more language-like in the sense that it's arbitrary? And the reason we don't know that, again, is just because it's hard to make the relevant observation. So one would be that if you and I are dolphins and there's a third dolphin over here, if I could say that dolphin's name is, and then I made a whistle, and you could know that and remember that independent of ever having heard that sound or that label from that dolphin themselves, that's the type of observation we would need, but we probably just can't make that.
Yeah. So one, just like one tiny correction, I guess. I wouldn't say that the dolphins are potentially just producing the whistle through like simple associative learning. I think it does seem pretty clear that there's a fair bit of intentionality involved, because they use it in very specific ways to get the attention of a particular individual. But it's not like every time they see that individual, they make that sound. It depends on the context.
Right. No, I guess what I'm saying though is like, when the other dolphins hear that sound, it's hard to know right now if I'm just going to refer to it as the name or the whistle of the dolphin. So if the sender sends their name, their whistle out into the world, the other dolphins are always hearing that sound, or mostly hearing that sound in association with seeing the other dolphin there.
Yeah.
So when they learn the name, so to speak, is it just this sensory association, or do they have a more symbolic representation of that dolphin that isn't strictly tied to the auditory stimulus always being present when that individual is visually present?
Yeah. Potentially. I think the key issue here is more one of how the names work. Like, do they rely on imitation or not, rather than necessarily what the implications would be about the cognitive representation. Because I think it's possible to have symbolic cognitive representation with or without imitation. Same way that, like we could use a buzzing sound as a symbol to refer to bees. We just don't.
Yeah. Okay. I get that. Can you give us a little bit more of a sense for how people have observed these dolphins using these whistles? So for example, dolphins live in pods. I know the very basics here. Dolphins live in pods, so they're social. There's many of them. Maybe one dolphin's swimming over here by himself, and he comes back into the group. Are there clear instances of the dolphin? I could imagine that the dolphin might announce his presence to the group generally, or whoever happens to be around, versus say, try and communicate specifically with an individual by saying, "Hey, you, I am here, and I want to get your attention as opposed to everyone else's." What sort of, in the natural ecology of the organism, how are they using these whistles?
So do you mean when they're producing their own signature whistle,
Yes,
or when they're
yes.
copying somebody else's signature
Well,
whistle?
let's take those one at a time. But I was thinking when they produce their own, how are they tending to use it?
That's a good question. I don't know because I haven't ever actually been in the field with
Yeah,
dolphins, studying them.
yeah,
I only know about this from the scientific literature. But my sense is that it's typically you're going to have in the wild, you're going to have more than two dolphins interacting.
yeah,
So it might be a little hard for researchers to be able to tell like who a particular whistle is directed towards
yeah,
when an individual
yeah,
is making their signature whistle. I know that dolphins make these whistles when they meet at sea. So especially when they encounter another individual, not as often when they're just together with another dolphin who've been together for a while. They're more likely to make it when they meet another dolphin. And it could be somebody they already know, of course, but just like, after some period of separation. And in captivity and when dolphins are temporarily captured at sea, they very often make their signature whistle kind of as a distress call, like
hmm,
to let other dolphins know where they are and potentially that they're in trouble. And this is kind of how signature whistles were originally discovered. That when people would capture or temporarily restrain dolphins and record them, they found that they were making these highly
yeah.
stereotyped whistles.
So they were not merely just yelling out like, ah, "Oh my God!" They were making sounds that were seemed to be unique dolphin to dolphin. Like,
Right,
I
like they
am
were
over
basically
here.
yelling out their own name
Yeah, yeah.
to let other dolphins know not just that there was an individual in distress, but specifically who it was.
Hmm, hmm. Interesting. So, let's get to the field work that you've done with
Mhm.
elephants, because I imagine, this is probably where some of the richest information you have is. Let's just give people a general sense before we get to like the paper that you've published recently. What can you give us just a kind of crash course on what we know and what we've learned, over the past few years and decades about vocal communication in elephants? Clearly they do it. Everyone knows that elephants make these, the characteristic trumpeting sounds, but what's sort of the spectrum of sounds that they make for the purpose of social communication, and what have we sort of learned about that leading up to your recent paper?
Yeah, so it's a little hard to summarize it all in a short soundbite. I actually wrote a whole book chapter about it, and even
Hmm.
that had to leave a lot of stuff out. But basically, so they make a really wide spectrum of sounds in terms of frequency.
Hmm.
So all elephants have, I guess you could say, kind of four-ish basic sounds that they make. Um, like very broad categories. So rumbles, which are harmonic sounds, they're very low in frequency, where the fundamental frequency of the rumble, at least for adult elephants, is typically below the limit of human hearing.
Hmm.
And but the higher harmonics are audible to us.
Yeah.
Then they make roars, which are these really loud broadband sounds that span a wide range of frequencies.
Yeah.
They make trumpets, which are the classic sound that everybody knows elephants make. And then they make shorter calls called barks, or in African savanna elephants, sometimes they make these more harmonic bark-like calls that are called cries. And those are like roars, but basically shorter in duration.
Hmm.
And then Asian elephants also have two entirely separate classes of vocalizations, which are much higher in frequency. And African elephants don't make those at all. And then all elephants will also sometimes combine calls into these vocalizations that we call combination calls, where it's typically a rumble and then like some kind of roar or bark. And they can be in any order, although certain orders are preferred over others.
I see. So there's a handful of classes of sounds that elephants make. They often
Right.
make one sound or another, but they can also combine them into pairs or sequences.
Yeah, so the combinations are most often two sounds, but sometimes they can be longer than that. So, the most common combinations would be roar rumble, rumble roar, and rumble roar rumble, but there are others as well.
Mhm. And I'll let you direct where to go, but like if we just think about these classes of sounds they make one at a time. What are the types of things that each one is used for? Do they have this sort of distinct things they refer to? Does one of them refer to an action? Another one refers to, like, announcing your presence, or how are they using these things?
Yeah. So an analogy I often give is like I think by classifying these sounds into such broad categories, and if we think of them as single call types, like if we think of rumbles as just one type of call, we're missing all of the interesting stuff.
I see.
So like, for example, if an alien scientist came down to Earth and was studying human communication, they might reasonably divide human vocalizations up into a handful of categories, screaming, crying, laughing, and then this other one called speech. Right. But that's missing all the interesting stuff.
Right.
And I think it's similar with the elephants. Like the rumbles are where a lot of the interesting stuff is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're by far the most common call type that they make. And they're really variable, both in their acoustic structure and in the context in which they're used.
Okay.
So that was the call type that I focused on.
Okay. So let's actually put a pin on that. Let's come back to rumbles in a minute, because it sounds like the one we'll spend the most time on. I would imagine that some of these calls are pretty just basically emotive. Like it's a way to express a basic emotion, the same way that crying or yelling or animals express basic emotions with characteristic types of calls. For some of these other calls, what are some of the basic things that are emoting with these?
So they're basically all the non-rumble call types are associated with some form of emotional arousal, and there seems to be a fair bit of overlap in how they're used. And there's also differences among the three elephant species. So African savanna elephants, African forest elephants, and Asian elephants. So trumpets are often used in Asian elephants, especially. They're particularly associated with agitation and aggressive or fearful contexts. Although the calves do also produce them in play, especially in captivity.
Yeah, but I mean, but
African elephants.
Yeah, but it's like in humans, right? Like little kids scream all the time. Yeah.
In African elephants, they also produce them maybe a little bit more frequently in social contexts, as like non-fearful social contexts as well, when there's a great deal of excitement about something.
Yeah.
But they also, of course, use them in disturbance contexts as well. Roars generally express some kind of negative emotion. So calves very often make them when they're denied access to their mom's breast. So when they're like trying to nurse and the mom's kicking them away, they'll roar. Asian elephants seem to use roars as contact calls sometimes to basically stay in touch with social affiliates at a distance. Whereas African elephants only use rumbles in that context. So it's kind of an interesting difference.
Is it because like the Asian elephants are in the jungle, so they might be relatively close by, but you can't see them through all the trees, and they just want to know, like, hey, are you still there?
Potentially. We have no idea. I mean, the roars travel quite a fair bit of distance as well as the rumbles. And as far as I know, there's no evidence that African forest elephants, which also live in a forest environment, use roars as contact calls. So I don't know why.
Okay.
But very often, like they'll also make a roar sometimes if they experience aggression from another individual and they're protesting that. Barks and cries. So cries have only been described in African savanna elephants. They're basically just like harmonic barks. So they're these sort of shorter broadband calls. And they're produced by calves, when the calf is distressed about something, often related to milk. The barks are produced kind of in opposite contexts by African savanna elephants and Asian elephants. So Asian elephants mostly make barks when they're being aggressive to somebody else, whereas African savanna elephants mostly make barks when they're receiving aggression. But in both cases, they're associated with some kind of, emotional outburst in the context of aggression. And then the squeaks and squeals that Asian elephants make are usually associated with some kind of disturbance or agitation.
Yeah. So all of those classes of sounds and their variations are pretty clearly, even if we don't understand the details, they're all associated with high states of arousal or emotional arousal of some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we've got these roars that are potentially more interesting here and what might be more language like. I suspect,
mean the rumbles?
Sorry, the rumbles. Yes. So just starting with their acoustic characteristics, what are these rumbles? What do they look like bioacoustically as opposed to these other types of sounds? Are they clearly distinguished in any way in terms of the actual acoustics that are emitted?
Yeah, so the two defining characteristics are they're highly harmonic. So they're not very noisy compared to the other call types. Rather, like when you look at them in a spectrogram, which is like a graphical representation of the sound, you see these very clear harmonic stacks where you have the fundamental frequency and then the harmonics like layered on top of it. So it looks like a stack of curved lines. And they're also much lower in frequency. So the fundamental frequency of rumbles is for adult elephants, like typically around maybe like 15 hertz for females, can be down to 10 hertz for some of the male rumbles. Calf rumbles will be higher in pitch, obviously, as they get bigger, their vocal cords get more massive. But they're much lower in pitch than all the other elephant call types.
So they're lower in pitch, but they also have a different structure. Is it fair to say, is it too simplistic to say that they're just generally more ordered in terms of their acoustic properties, or?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Because the other calls tend to have more noise and more chaos in them.
Yeah.
Whereas these are much more harmonic, and I think you can think of harmonic versus noisy vocalizations as more versus less ordered. In a sense, so that, yeah, I think that makes sense.
And is there some kind of analogy here? It's like, I want to give people a sense for what harmonic means too. Is there some kind of analogy here we can draw with music or something?
Yeah, so if you hear a sound that, like, most sounds that we think sound nice or not unpleasant are often harmonic sounds. So they're so there's kind of, there are pure tones, which is like, actually doesn't sound that nice. It just sounds like a beep. And then a harmonic sound is like a pure tone with which is at a particular frequency. That's the fundamental frequency. And then the harmonics are whole integer multiples of that fundamental. So like, let's say you have the fundamental frequency is at 100 hertz. That's like 100 cycles of the sound wave per second. The second harmonic, that is the next one after the fundamental, would be 200 hertz. And then the next one would be 300 hertz, or I guess we'd be 300 hertz and then 400 hertz, etc. So you're basically the step between harmonics is equal to the fundamental frequency. And so it sounds kind of like, most sounds that mammals make are harmonic. Our speech sounds are highly harmonic. A lot of musical instruments will be harmonic. Whereas like a noisy sound would be something like a drum beat or just heavy metal screaming.
I see.
Right, where it's
a cacophony,
periodic vibration of your vocal cords. Instead, it's just vibrating chaotically. And if you look at it in a spectrogram, it looks like a smear across the frequency spectrum.
Okay, so these elephants make this type of this class of sounds. Give us a sense of the behavioral ecology here. What are the contexts? Is there a particular species you want to focus on? But like, what are the contexts they're used in most frequently? What do they seem to when and how do they seem to be using these types of sounds?
So the interesting thing about rumbles is that they're made in almost every context, which makes them a lot harder to understand what they're for. But also more interesting because human speech is also used in pretty much every context. And so that suggests that there's a lot of interesting and variable things that they can communicate about. So, for example, some of the more people have tried to divide rumbles up into different subtypes based on both their acoustic structure and the context in which they're used. But there's a lot of variability, and they kind of grade from one subtype into another. So it's not like you can divide them into very neat categories that always look and sound a certain way. So one very common context in which rumbles are used is as contact calls, where the caller and the intended recipient are out of sight of each other, and the caller is trying to reinitiate contact with their social affiliate who's out of sight. And so those rumbles often tend to have kind of a slightly arched pattern. They tend to be quite loud because they're produced at a distance. Another common context is let's go rumbles, where an elephant who wants the group to initiate movement in a particular direction will stand kind of at the periphery of the group, facing in the direction that he or she wants to go. And they make these let's go rumbles, which are sort of flatter in frequency profile and a little bit longer than contact rumbles typically. And then that often precipitates like a back and forth exchange of rumbles among several individuals in the group. And then the group will either move off in a particular direction or not move off sometimes.
So superficially, and this is a subject where it's hard, it can be very hard not to anthropomorphize, and we could even argue about whether the extent to which that's appropriate. But what you just described naively sounds like someone says, "Let's go this way," and then the group deliberates and then does it or doesn't.
Yeah, it's possible that that's actually what they're doing. It seems like there's some form of negotiation, whether that's actually analogous to like a human conversation negotiating something, we don't know, but it seems that there is some kind of back and forth exchange of information that influences whether or potentially where the group moves. But we don't really understand a lot about what kind of information is encoded in those rumbles, other than that they are used in this context where somebody's trying to initiate group movement.
Okay, and then what are other examples?
There's so many. So they use them as alarm signals if they're threatened by humans or lions. They use it like as in protest situations. So kind of if a calf is miffed that their mom won't let them nurse, typically they'll start with rumbles, and then if they get really annoyed, they'll move into roars. And they use rumbles in a greeting context as well. So when two individuals who are bonded to each other approach one another after some period of separation, they make these greeting rumbles. In African elephants, at least, especially African savanna elephants, it's usually associated with like a more elaborate behavioral display where they're being really exuberant. They make other highly emotional calls too. They kind of spin around, they urinate, defecate. There's a lot of excitement. And then they also make them in what are sometimes called little greeting contexts, where two individuals who have been in the same group all day, but maybe one of them just approaches the other to within touching distance. And then they'll make a rumble as well, but it's more subdued than these like louder, exuberant greeting displays. They also, mothers and allo mothers, so like females other than the mother who help take care of a calf, they'll produce rumbles called coo rumbles to the calf in kind of two different contexts. One is when they're comforting the calf after the calf has expressed distress about something, and the other is where they're basically touching or nursing the calf in a calm context with no apparent distress. And those two types of rumbles, like it doesn't seem like they're acoustically distinct from each other, so we just call them a single type coo rumbles. And so they're kind of like, I think in my paper I actually called them caregiving rumbles to give them a more functional description. But I think those are kind of some of the more common categories.
And so these are a lot of social use here, clearly. And some of them, start to imply that it's not just sort of general vocalizations directed towards everyone. Some of these could be personal and even individual.
Right.
And so, where does this start to bleed into some of the research you've done on whether or not they're calling each other by unique names?
Yeah. So what we did basically is focused on rumbles where we were able to identify the individual who made the call, and also where we were able to identify a single individual recipient of the call. So sometimes elephants will make a rumble and everybody in the group responds. But sometimes they'll make a rumble and only one specific individual responds. And sometimes they'll make a rumble in a context where it's clear that they're only communicating to a specific individual. So for example, with greeting rumbles, it's very easy. If it's especially little greeting rumbles where it's just two individuals, one individual approaches another, somebody makes a call, and then the other individual responds. It's very obvious there's a caller, there's a receiver. Same thing with the coo rumbles to calves, like the caregiver's making the call and the intended recipient is obviously the calf, because it's just those two individuals interacting. With contact rumbles, it's a little bit more challenging.
Right.
You can't be in two places at once, and usually the receiver is outside of the line of sight of the caller. But sometimes we were able to figure out that contact call was directed to one specific individual. Typically, this was in a situation where, for example, we had been following the group all day, so we knew everybody who was in the group that day, and everybody except for one individual continued on, one individual was lagging behind the group, and then somebody in the main body of the group would make a contact call, often while facing in the direction of the individual who was lagging. So we could, in that situation, we could reasonably infer that it was a contact call directed to that one specific individual. So basically, we gathered all of these calls where we were confident that they were addressed to just one individual, and we knew who that individual was.
Yeah.
And then we measured a bunch of features of the acoustic properties of these calls, and then we tried to use a random forest model, like a type of machine learning classifier, to assign those calls to to basically predict who a call was addressed to, just from the acoustic properties of that call.
Yeah. So at this point, let's do two things. So one, in essence, once you get to this point, you've identified these contexts in which it's quite clear that there's communication from an individual to another individual, even though this is like often in a group context. So you've got contextual factors that are helping you discern when you can sort of isolate, one-on-one conversations, so to speak. And so at that point, you're basically saying, okay, are they saying, hey, Mickey, like, come, you're falling behind, keep up? Or are they just going, hey, like, and so now you've got to distinguish if they're making this sort of general sound directed at an individual versus using a sound that is only directed at that individual that would never be used to make the same kind of call to someone else.
Exactly. Yeah. That was the big question, right? So my postdoctoral supervisor and one of my collaborators had been studying it. I mean, they've been studying elephants for decades. And so over the course of their experience with elephants, they had observed a lot of situations where elephants were vocalizing, and it seemed like just one individual responded. But we didn't know for sure if the calls had some information in them that identified a specific intended recipient, or if in those instances where just one individual responds, it was just because that was the only individual who felt like responding in that particular instance. So we needed to know if these calls actually contain some information that is specific to the intended receiver of the call.
Yeah. And before getting to some of the punchline here, the other thing I wanted to bring up at this point was, how are you making these measurements? You're out in the field following elephants. How close are you to the elephants? How are you literally making the acoustic measurements? How is all of this being measured?
Yeah, so the nice thing about working with the population of elephants that I work with, which is in Samburu and Buffalo Springs National Reserves in northern Kenya, is that this population has been studied for decades. So the elephants are very habituated to researchers in a vehicle, and we can drive up pretty close to them. So I was making these recordings from anywhere from like 25 to 5 meters away. I tried to be at least 20, like no more than 20 meters from the elephants to get good quality audio. And they were fine with that. Like they just kind of treat you like a feature of the environment. And so we would just follow them around all day until they went into a place where we couldn't access with the vehicle. And basically whenever the elephants stopped or were moving very slowly, we just turned off the car and recorded continuously. And then whenever an elephant vocalized, I used this trick that I learned from another elephant researcher, where I had this thing called a stenomask, which is something that court reporters sometimes use to basically whisper dictation into an audio recorder without that sound like being heard by anybody else.
So now you can pick up sounds
into this dictaphone.
Yeah, you can annotate the recordings.
Yeah, and then I would annotate the recordings in real time, and my voice wouldn't get picked up by the microphone that was recording the elephants, because it was this sort of like semi-soundproof device around. I
see. Okay, so there's technology that was developed for courtroom use, like if someone wanted to take notes, like for a court case, and it's not just going to disturb the actual court case, but they can still say something and record it. You can use that to annotate the stuff that you're measuring from the elephants. So like so I imagine you're talking into this device, but when you're picking up sounds from the elephants at a distance, you've got some kind of directional microphone that you're just sort of pointing in their direction. How do you control, like, if you want to record from that elephant, but not that elephant, and they're both 25 meters away from you, how do you start to record from elephant by elephant here?
So basically you can't. So my understanding, I'm far from an audio engineer, but my understanding is that When you're trying to record infrasound, like really low frequencies, there basically aren't any commercially available microphones that are directional. That all the directional microphones essentially strip away those lower frequencies. And so we were using an omnidirectional microphone that didn't decrease the sound pressure levels from any particular direction. So we were picking up everything. And basically what we would try to do is stay close to the individual that we were trying to record, so that when she vocalized, if there were no overlapping sounds, we would get a nice clean recording.
I see.
But sometimes there were overlapping sounds, and unfortunately we just had to not use those.
And so I guess you're just sort of recording everything being emitted by the elephants, and there's a wide spectrum of literal like frequencies represented here, which is why you had to do it in the way you just described. But then sort of the specificity that you can get, as good as it can get, it comes from your annotation. So I guess, at one point in the recording, you can say like, okay, that sound that you just heard was clearly coming from Jake the elephant. And that sound, we're not quite sure who's coming from, so we don't know. And then the next sound is coming from, John the elephant or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. So basically we would use various techniques in the field to figure out who was calling. Sometimes elephants have behavioral cues that are associated with vocalizing, so that sometimes helped. And then also if you're close enough to the elephant when they vocalize, you can tell that it's them if they're the only individual who's that close, just based on how loud it is and what direction it's coming from and that kind of thing. But sometimes we weren't able to tell, and so again, we weren't able to use those calls. So it was quite challenging to get enough recordings to do anything with it, just because most of the sounds that you record, either it's you're too far away from the elephant and the recording isn't good quality, or somebody else vocalizes at the same time, or you just can't tell who's making the sound, or we don't know who they were calling to. That was very often the case as well. So it kind of whittled down to a large extent the recordings we were able to use.
So obviously, this field work is, you're describing how you can measure things and what the limitations are. It's very difficult to control. This is not a controlled laboratory setting, but you have ways of annotating the data. You can sometimes tell using behavioral cues and just, and annotating the data in the ways that you described. Obviously, there's only so much specificity you have in a data set like this, but when it's all said and done, what were the types of things that you felt like you could confidently discern from this data in terms of anything akin to name calling?
So one thing we were able to do is we were able to train a machine learning model to correctly predict who a call was addressed to just from the acoustic properties of that call, which was sort of a first step at suggesting that there might be something in these calls like a name. But that wasn't conclusive evidence for names by itself, because there's a lot of other possibilities for how the model could have learned that. So for example, maybe it was just picking up on things like every caller has a unique voice. We know that to be the case in elephants and many other animals. And so maybe it was picking up on like the unique voice of the caller and then guessing who the receiver was most likely to be, simply based on the fact that some callers called more to certain receivers.
Okay.
So to rule out alternative explanations like that, we took advantage of a really nice property of random forest models, which is that they provide you with a measure of similarity between each possible pair of calls in the data set, called proximity scores. And so we extracted these metrics of similarity from the structure of the random forest, and then we used those to show that calls from the same caller to the same receiver were significantly more similar on average than calls from the same caller to two different receivers. So basically, even when we held caller identity constant, we found that calls addressed to different receivers were distinct. And so that was, I think, much stronger evidence that these calls contain some receiver-specific information. And then the second piece of evidence is that we did an experiment in the field where we played back the calls to the elephants and recorded their responses.
I see.
And we found...
So roughly speaking, the idea is if these things are something like a name, you would expect the elephant that name is attached to maybe orient towards you guys more than other elephants or something like that.
Yeah, so we expected them to respond more strongly.
And what does respond mean?
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't specifically orienting, because elephants, they have, I mean, they do orient towards sounds, but sometimes it's not the most obvious
Yeah.
response. And so we did measure that, but in addition to that, we also measured their latency to approach the speaker. So how quickly they approach the speaker in response to the playback, their latency to vocalize in response to the playback. So how quickly they made a call of their own in response, and then also how many calls they made in response.
And just to make sure I'm following, so when you are emitting this vocalization, are you emitting another? Is it like the sound of another elephant in the group saying their potential name, or is it just their potential name in some new voice?
No, we used actual raw recordings of another elephant in the group saying their name, because I think the biggest limitation of this study is we don't yet know exactly how these putative names are encoded in the calls.
Yeah.
So we can't yet synthesize a name.
Yeah, you can't abstract
in an artificial voice.
Okay, I got it. Okay.
Yeah. I would love to do that in the future. That would kind of be the next step.
Yeah. Okay, but so you're playing back sounds that another elephant in the group emits that might contain at least a portion of it, the potential name here, and you're basically saying, does that individual that we think we're referring to, are they responding in some way more so than other individuals?
Exactly. Yeah. So the idea was that if we play back a call of, say, elephant A, calling to elephant B, then we would expect, and if this call is a name as opposed to, say, just a generic call that they like, hey, that they use to call everybody, then we would expect B to respond more strongly to that call than to a different call from caller A that was originally addressed to somebody else.
Yes.
Right. So by playing back every individual two calls, one that was originally addressed to them and one from the same caller that was originally addressed to someone else, we basically controlled for the possibility that they might just be responding to the voice of the caller because they have a stronger affiliation with that individual.
Yep. And okay, so what's the punchline here?
So we found that they approached the speaker more quickly, they vocalized more quickly, and they produced more vocalizations in response to a call that was originally addressed to them compared to a call from the same caller addressed to somebody else.
So the behavior is consistent with the idea that something like a name is being used here.
Exactly, yeah. So it suggests that they're able to determine just by hearing a call if it was intended for them or if it was intended for another individual. So that kind of strength, that combined with the analysis of the proximity scores, and the fact that these calls contain some acoustic information that's specific to the individual receiver, that combined with the playback experiment strengthened our conclusion that these calls contain something like a name.
And I haven't looked at the analysis myself, but can you give me a sense for like the effect size here? Is this a very clear big effect, or is this kind of subtle and ambiguous a lot of the time?
So for the playback experiment, it was quite a substantial effect, especially given the small sample size. We only had 17 individuals. And we had no idea if all the calls we were playing back contained names. Like, it's quite possible that even if elephants have names, they don't use them in every call. So there was a lot of noise in this data, and we still got a pretty substantial effect. For the analysis of the proximity scores, I'd say we had maybe so we did a couple analyses with that. We certainly had a stronger effect size for the finding that calls from the same caller to the same receiver were more similar than calls from the same caller to different receivers. When we also wanted to know if different callers use the same name for the same receiver. And so we looked at,
I was going to ask that.
Okay. So well, we can talk about that next.
Okay, so in essence, like one of the tricky things here is it's like you have these you're making these playbacks. You've recorded vocalizations from elephants, and you're playing them back now to see what happens. And like if I was trying to get your attention and a group of us were hanging out, like a group of friends or family or whatever, and I wanted to get your attention, I could say, "Hey, Michael." I could say, "Hey," but like look at you. I could say, "Hey, Michael," and others. There's many different ways I could partially or completely try and get just your attention or your
Right.
attention plus other people's. And so when you have these recordings you're playing back, you guys don't actually know. Are they saying just, hey, Michael? Or are they saying something similar, something that includes your name and other names or whatever? And so that's a tricky part of this.
Yeah, exactly. And the challenge is that, we wouldn't expect them to use names in every utterance.
Right,
So
right.
we didn't know a priori which
Mhm,
calls might
mhm,
contain something like a name and which might not.
mhm.
So yeah, so again, like for some of the analyses that we did, the effect sizes were quite small. I think the ones where the effect
Yeah,
size were biggest is the two that I've talked about so
yeah,
far, where
yeah,
like the evidence that the calls are specific to individual
yeah,
receivers and that the elephants respond more strongly
yeah.
to calls that were originally addressed to them.
Okay, so now the question is, okay, if they are using something like a name, then if I'm trying to get Michael's attention, I'm going to say, "Hey, Michael." But if someone else needs to get Michael's attention, they're also going to call out to Michael as opposed to
Yeah.
Pete or Dave. So are multiple individuals calling to the same elephant using the same sounds?
Yeah, so that is a good question. So that's where we had slightly more ambiguous results. So using those same proximity scores that I talked about before, we found that calls from two different callers addressed to the same receiver were more similar on average than calls from two different callers addressed to different receivers.
Mhm.
But that effect size was relatively small. It was statistically significant, but relatively small. And then we tried to train a random forest to learn to predict the receiver of a call um, by training it on calls from some callers and then testing it on calls
From
made by
other
other
callers.
callers.
Yeah.
And it wasn't able to do that.
Hmm.
Now, I suspect the reason it wasn't is because we had a limited sample size, especially when we partition the data out in this way, where we had relatively, like, for the calls addressed to a given receiver, we might have most of them from one particular caller and very few from other callers. So it's not too surprising the random forest wasn't able to learn this. But because it wasn't able to learn this, it makes our conclusions about whether different callers are using the same name for the same receiver somewhat inconclusive. So
Yeah.
I think
So
we
it's
have
fair to say that
suggested evidence.
these results are interesting and suggestive and consistent
Yeah,
with the idea that something like names are used, but they're not totally definitive.
yeah, especially if you define names as being like everybody's using the same label for the same receiver, then I'd say our results are far more suggestive than definitive.
Mhm.
If you define names more broadly as any sort of call that is specific to a single individual receiver, then I think we have stronger evidence for that.
Mhm.
But yeah, it kind of depends again, like sort of like with the word language, the word name can be defined in a broader sense or in a more
Right.
narrow sense.
Right. Um, and of course, like it's important to try and study these things as methodically as possible. And,
Mhm.
on the one hand, you've got limitations in the field work that come from the fact that you're in the field rather than in the lab, right? You can't bring a group of elephants into the lab and control all the relevant things here that you might want to in principle. But on the other hand, you're looking at real naturalistic behavior in
Mhm.
context.
Right.
And, ultimately that's, I think, what's interesting, right? Is how do
Yeah,
things
me
work out
too.
in the real world? Um, so data is important, statistics are important, analysis is important. Using reductionistic approaches like laboratory analysis, all of these things are important. I'm a laboratory guy. That's how I was trained.
Right.
But also, we can't forget to just use common sense and your observations in the field. Can you just give us like your sense? You spent a lot of time with these elephants out in the
Mhm.
field. You've done these types of studies. You've seen all the different types of things they do. Does it look like they're calling each other individually?
Yeah, it kind of does. I mean, I'm always cautious about interpreting, subjective experience and anecdotal evidence like that because it's so easy to just let your bias or what you hope is true slip into it. But yeah, just from my personal observations of the elephants, there are a lot of instances where you'll see a group of elephants and somebody makes a call and then one member of the group responds and nobody else does. And then the same individual might make a call on a different day and a different member of the group responds.
Yeah.
And also so in those instances it really looks like they might be directing communication to one specific individual in the group. And yet on other times, like sometimes they'll make a call and everybody responds. So
Right.
it seems like sometimes they might be using these name like calls and sometimes they're not. And Another thing is that often we would see individuals producing a call, like I described a little bit before, where there would be like a contact calling situation where somebody's lagging behind the group. And it was very obvious that they were directing a call to that specific individual, because they'd be, the rest of the group would have moved off a little bit. Then one member of the group would kind of hang back and face in the direction of the lagging individual and just call repeatedly until that lagging individual met up with her. And then she would immediately turn around and they would go together towards the rest of the group. So it's very obvious she was directing communication to that specific individual. So it's at least a situation in which I would expect them to potentially be using names, if that's something that they do.
Yeah, I want to back up for just a second and ask you some very basic questions about elephants. So the type of elephants that you study in Africa for these experiments about vocalization and communication, give us a sense, how big are these groups normally? How long are the elephants living? How long do they tend to have relationships for? They're living multiple decades, right?
Yeah, so they in the wild they can easily live into their 50s or early 60s. Obviously, a lot of them don't make it that far, because of disease or being shot by humans or whatever. But there are a lot of individuals who make it into their 60s. So they're maintaining these relationships for life in many cases. Female elephants in African savanna elephants, they basically stay with their natal group, the group that they were born into, for life, in the vast majority of cases. And they have this really complex society that's sort of structured with like nested groups. So the tightest knit group is, we call a family group, and then multiple related family groups form a more loosely knit bond group, and then multiple bond groups that are often unrelated to each other form a even more loosely knit affiliation that we call a clan.
I see. Okay, clan. Yeah, it's like a human clan.
Yeah, so they have hundreds of relationships with other individuals.
But it's given how long they live, given their ability to remember, just given all the things that we know are true for elephants, like it would be shocking if they aren't recognizing other individuals at an individual for individual level.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, individual recognition is super common in vertebrates, or at least social vertebrates, and it would be almost impossible to explain a lot of elephants' behavior if they couldn't recognize each other individually.
Yeah.
Plus, we have direct experimental evidence that they do from previous studies.
Yeah. And can you talk a little bit more about like the social structure here? Like how are the little family groups ordered, and how are the clans ordered? My rough understanding is that elephants are matriarchal, like the mother is a very important determiner of who's related to who.
So they're often described as matriarchal, and I don't know if that's necessarily the most appropriate way to describe their society, because matriarchal implies that females are dominant to males, like in spotted hyenas, for example, but that's not the case in elephants. It's rather that they're sex segregated. So the males leave their natal group when they reach puberty, and they go off on their own, and then they form relationships with other males.
I see.
And they kind of have their own society that's separate from the females.
In that way, it's kind of like lions, is it not? Sort
of.
Yeah, because don't they kind of kick the males out once they get old enough?
Philopatry and male dispersal.
Yeah. Okay. So if elephant is born into a family, he's going to be surrounded by a lot of older women, including his mother, older female elephants, and eventually, if it's a male baby, when he grows up, hits puberty, he will have to leave, and then he'll go off by himself and maybe hang out with some other males for some time. But if it's a female elephant, she will. If a mother has she'll stay and grow up and just stay with that family for life.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then within those female groups, they're led by the oldest female, who we call the matriarch.
Yeah.
So basically, the males and females just kind of do their own things separately from each other. Occasionally, males will visit female groups for brief periods of time and hang out with them.
Yeah.
But they're not leading those groups, and they're not really spending much time with those groups. And within those female groups, they're led by the oldest female.
So so the males leave when they hit puberty, and then like, do they frequently come back to like their mother's family? Do they visit families where they've had daughters and sons? Or the males just kind of like randomly meeting up with different groups of other elephants?
It it depends a lot on the individual. So there are some males who don't disperse very far from where they were born. Like
Yeah.
in the Samburu population, we have some males who were born there, and are there as adults. But we also have males who have come in from other populations from really far away. And there are males who disperse far away from Samburu too, presumably. Um, so with those males who stick around in the general vicinity of their mother's group, they do sometimes go back and visit them. Um, we we know from prior work that elephants can recognize their kin, and their male elephants are much less likely to mate with kin than with non-kin. So
I
they
see.
kind of avoid um, like sexual interaction with their female relatives. And interestingly, they can do that for both maternal and paternal kin. They're
Hmm.
better at recognizing maternal kin, obviously, because they grew up with them, right? But they have some mechanism of recognizing who their paternal kin are, even though like they have no idea who the father is,
Right.
right? It's just, presumably have no idea,
Hmm.
because elephants are polygynous, so, or polygynandrous, right? Like everybody kind of mates with females, mate with multiple males, males mate with multiple females. There's no like pair bonding or anything like
Hmm.
that.
How are
Um,
so the males leave the family group, which is led by a group of adult females, led by a matriarch who's the oldest female. So when the males become reproductively mature, or probably just before that, I would guess, they get kicked out of the group basically. But obviously mating happens, and so an adult male has to come and court and mate with a female at some point who's part of this maternal group, this female-led
yeah,
group. How are mating decisions by females actually made? Are they made at an individual level? Like how do they allow adult males to get close
that
enough and do the courtship and all that?
that's a really good question. So number one, I'm not sure if they get kicked out of the group.
Mm.
It seemed to me, just by observing this casually, that it was far more that the as males got older and older, they started spending more and more time apart from the group until
They
they just
just
kind of
weren't as
wandered
interested in
off
hanging
and
out.
became independent. Yeah, and they
Okay.
started hanging out more with other males. I didn't really see a lot of aggression from older females toward the adolescent males. They just seemed to kind of wander off on
I
their
see. I
own.
see. So it's not like
Um,
there was a period in my life where I had parakeets and they would lay eggs, and when they had a couple batches of eggs, and the mother would basically, if the chick got old enough and didn't spontaneously leave the nest, eventually she would really
she
push
would
them
kick them
out.
out. Yeah,
But it sounds like
yeah,
it's more the case that in the males they just start hanging around less and less because that's just what they're inclined to do.
yeah. That's what it looked like to me. I wasn't explicitly studying that or measuring that, but I didn't
Yeah,
see a lot of aggression towards
yeah.
those males. Um,
So how do we know?
yeah,
Like, how
so
does mating happen in elephants then? Like, what does the courtship phase look like?
yeah, so basically, female elephants only come into estrus rarely. The inner birth interval is like something like 4 years on average. And
4 years of their entire life?
no, like the interbirth interval. So
Oh,
like
the
the time
interbirth
in
interval is
between
4 years.
successive calves
Okay.
is like 40 years.
Got it.
So they come into estrus. They're typically in estrus for just a few days at a time.
Mhm.
And males find them presumably by smell, but also by sound. So
Mm.
females make calls when they're in estrus that are sort of typical of that hormonal state,
Yep.
right? And males respond to those calls and move towards them. And females prefer to mate with males who are bigger, which means older, because male elephants grow continuously throughout their life.
Hmm.
And also males who are in must. So male elephants go through this hormonal cycle every year. Like once they hit their late 20s, they start going, or maybe like 30, they start regularly experiencing this period called must, where their testosterone peaks, and they start ranging a lot further and searching for females, and being a lot more aggressive and interested in sexual behavior.
Wow. In their
And
30s.
yeah, they're really late mature. So like it depends on the population. If
Sure, sure.
if there are no if there are no really big mature bulls, males will enter must at a younger age.
Yeah.
But typically, like when they first start, they'll go into must very briefly, and it's not very profound. It's not very pronounced must. But then as they get older, the must periods get longer and longer. And usually, like by the time they're going into must regularly for like a substantial period of time, they're in their late 20s or early 30s. Um,
Wow.
And so like when they're in must, they're a lot more attractive to females, and they're also dominant to other males. So a male who's not in must will typically defer to a male who is in must, even if he's bigger. And then among must males, generally the bigger an individual is, the more dominant he is.
But like when actual courtship is happening from between one female and one male, is it like a female is, in estrus and she just kind of goes off kind of on her own for a while, and there's like this one-on-one semi-private interaction, or does like a male have to come up to the group and get like the matriarch's approval? Like what does the approval thing look like? Yeah.
That is a good question. So actually, this is why I don't think it makes sense to call elephants matriarchal, because the adult males are dominant to adult females.
I see.
They just don't live with adult females.
So even the families are led by this matriarch, the most senior mother, but it's not like she's calling all the shots on everything.
Right. Like she's the leader of her family.
Yeah.
But then if a male comes in from outside, the males just kind of come up to the females. And if the male is big enough, like he's dominant to those females. And, they will kind of like defer to him and move out. I mean, he's not leading the group, but
they are, they will be sexually submissive to him if he inserts himself. Yeah.
And males very often visit females, even when they're not in must, to kind of check them and potentially see when they might be coming into estrus next. And it's very common for an adult male to hang out with a female group for a day and just like travel with them, and the females don't seem to mind it. They interact socially with the male. If a male is in must, they really are excited about it, so they vocalize a lot. Everybody's kind of crowds around him. Everyone wants to smell him.
Wow.
They're really interested in males who are in must. And when a female's in estrus, usually you'll get a lot of males, including multiple must males, converging on that group all at once because they can tell she's in estrus. And what will end up happening is she runs away and they chase her. And they go in this like really long chase where she's making these estrus roars the whole time. And this is kind of where the mate choice happens, right? So like the female has some ability to control copulation, because if she starts walking, the male can't really stay mounted because he'll just fall over. So she basically can refuse a male by just not standing still.
In essence, at the right time, multiple males will be literally chasing one female, and she can kind of pick who wins.
Yeah, exactly. And the males will also like fight it out amongst each other. So if there's one really big must bull there, the other guys are going to just hang back because they don't want to risk getting injured. And there will be some mate guarding that takes place as well. So the must bull will who mates with a female will often hang out with her for a while and chase away any other males, and the females seem to prefer that because they get less harassed that way. So, it was really interesting. I saw this one instance where we had, like a big old must bull who had mated with a female in estrus. And then as soon as he mated with her, he just like noped out of there. He just left. And the entire female group chased after him, calling after him, like presumably trying to get him to come back and mate guard the female that he had just mated with. And he was like, no, I'm done.
Wow. They're like, hey, what are you doing? Your job isn't done here.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, no, I mated. I'm moving on to somebody else now.
Wow. Let's leave it at that before we get in trouble. Okay. Oh, so I mean, it's just, I didn't really know anything about elephant social structure, beyond the fact that, they're not, as you said, they're not matriarchal in the sense that the females are dominant to everyone and to the males, but the family groups, they're female led. But then it sounds like the family, they congregate into these larger groups that are basically clans.
Right. And that's somewhat seasonal as well. So typically in the wet season, when more food is available, you'll get larger aggregations of elephants, whereas in the dry season, when food is more scarce, they split up into smaller groups, and even sometimes the family groups will split off into smaller units to forage.
But it sounds like that in terms of behavioral dominance and hierarchies here, elephants they're obviously big animals, but they grow for life. They live a long time. And it sounds, if I'm hearing you right, it sounds in general like the bigger the animal, the older the animal, the more dominant the animal. And they kind of just follow that logic.
Yeah, pretty much. in between families of elephants, the dominance of an individual relative to an individual from another family is determined based on the dominance of their matriarchs. So if matriarch A is dominant to matriarch B, then everybody in family A is dominant to everybody in family B.
I see.
But within a family, it seems to be based entirely on size and age.
Yeah.
So in a lot of social animals like baboons, for example, animals inherit their social rank from their mother.
Mm-hmm.
So like the kid of like a high ranked female might be dominant to an adult from a lower ranked family within a baboon troop, but that's not the case in elephants. It's just everybody's rank is just determined by their age.
Yeah. So I mean, related to the subject of, being a long-lived species with memories and with the ability to know individuals and with very sophisticated cognition, whatever exactly that means. Clearly it's very sophisticated compared to most other animals.
Right.
This is why elephants are famous and why they're interesting. One thing I wanted to ask you about, maybe you haven't studied this specifically, but I'm sure that you know about it, is I've heard reports that elephants will actually mourn their dead, potentially even bury the dead, return to the sites of their bones and things like that. What do you know about that stuff and how they treat the death of members of their family?
Yeah. So elephants show inordinate interest in the remains of dead elephants compared to the remains of other dead animals. So people have done some experiments where they presented elephants with the bones of elephants versus the bones of other large animals like giraffes, and they show no interest in the bones of other species, but they show a lot of interest in the bones of elephants. They'll pick them up, smell them, sometimes carry them for a distance. They also will routinely visit carcasses of elephants, both of their relatives and non-relatives. So in the Samburu population, basically within protected areas, my former postdoc supervisor did a study where they looked at all the elephant carcasses that they could find, and every carcass within a protected area showed signs of multiple repeated visitation by elephants. And when they interact with like a very recently deceased or dying individual, they'll often show helping behavior. So if an individual is down and can't get up or is dying, they'll sometimes try to lift them up or try to support them so they can stand. They've occasionally been observed trying to lift up the bodies of very recently deceased elephants, but they don't do that with more like with older carcasses. So they seem to understand the difference between a carcass and somebody who might still be alive, which is intriguing because it suggests that they might have an awareness of like the finality of death. In terms of burying carcasses, in African savanna elephants, they've been directly observed throwing dirt and branches on top of carcasses. They don't always do that, but they do that sometimes. In Asian elephants, there was an interesting paper that came out, I think last year, where they found indirect evidence that elephants might be burying calves, like actually burying them in the ground. But they didn't have direct observations of it. So basically they found like some calves that had, I think it was like 5 or 6 calves that had been buried in drainage ditches, where they were part of their body was covered in dirt, but the legs were still sticking up above the ground. And based on several different indirect lines of evidence, the authors argued that they had been buried by other elephants, but they didn't have direct observations of that. So I don't know if they actually buried those calves or not, but certainly in African elephants, people have observed them like putting debris and dirt on top of the body.
And it's not difficult. Elephants obviously could have a general interest in dead elephants because they recognize that it's elephants. But to the extent that they are family bonded, to the extent that they care about individuals in their family more, akin to humans, right? Is
right.
So let's say an elephant dies. And I don't know, maybe there's multiple groups with overlapping territory, I would imagine. And maybe all of the groups will stop at the site of the carcass or the bones or whatever, they'll have that tendency in general. But to the extent that they care about their family and their individuals, you would expect the family of the deceased elephant to go there more, to linger for longer, and so forth.
Yeah.
Is there any indication that is happening?
That I don't know. I'm not sure if anybody has explicitly tested that. I know there was one study, like the study I mentioned, that looked at carcasses, whether carcasses were visited by other elephants. They found that elephants were, I think, if I remember correctly, I think they found that elephants were equally likely to visit the carcasses of relatives and non-relatives. But I don't think they looked at how much time they spent at the carcass or how they interacted with the carcass and whether that differed between relatives and non-relatives.
So what, like, so, and I'll let you take this where you want it, but like when it comes to your general observations of elephants, not just limited to the vocal communication stuff, what are some of the more sophisticated or impressive or human-like things that they do that you have studied or that you know about? What are things that, things that are impressive, but also things that people might be surprised that elephants do or they're not normally known for?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I would say I think the name like calls is pretty cool, but obviously I'm biased because that was my study. I think the way that they interact with dead elephants is pretty unusual in the animal kingdom, and I think that's pretty unique. And they're not the only species that have behavior like that, but they're among the few, and it's so I think that's particularly interesting. I think like they're generally like social cognition is where they shine the most and where they show a lot of similarities with humans and other highly social animals. So for example, they're in comparative language evolution research. One thing that people are often really interested in is intentionality in communication. Because one of the key features of language is that it's intentional, where we're not just communicating out of a sort of emotional outburst, but rather we are intending to inform the individual that we're communicating with, which implies we have some understanding of what they know and what they don't know. And there's evidence for that in elephants. So for example, when elephants are communicating like with gestures, they tend to use gestures to combine with a vocalization if the individual that they're trying to communicate with can't see them. But if the individual is facing them, then they'll often just use a gesture with no sound. So it implies some understanding of what other individuals can see,
right?
And therefore whether they're likely to react to a particular signal, because if it's a purely visual signal, they can't see you, there's no point in making that.
It implies that they have ability to model another individual's mind in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so on the topic of self-awareness in elephants, so this is kind of, that thing with the gestures kind of implies an awareness of what other individuals can see, but there's also some evidence that elephants may be aware of themselves. And this is, I say some evidence because it just hasn't been done with very many individuals. And but the classic test for self-awareness in animals is the mirror mark test, right? Where an animal, you put a mark on a part of the animal's body they couldn't see without the aid of a mirror, and then if they touch that mark more in the presence of a mirror than in its absence, then that implies that they can recognize their reflection, which may mean that they're self-aware. So that study has been done with a few Asian elephants, and one of the Asian elephants convincingly passed the test. Like if you watch, the videos are available on the internet. If you watch those videos, I think it was Happy at the Bronx Zoo. Like she was very clearly responding more to the mark in the presence of the mirror. The other elephants that where that test was done with failed the test. But the problem with the mirror mark test is there's a lot of false negatives. So just because the animal doesn't touch the mark doesn't mean they don't recognize their reflection. They may just not care about it, especially with elephants, because they're always covering themselves in dirt and debris. So like, why do they care about a mark on their face, right? So the fact that at least one elephant passed that test, I think, is highly suggestive evidence that at least Asian elephants are probably self-aware.
Wow. What about one thing I wanted to ask you about on the vocalization side of it? So you were looking at whether or not they were naming each other in essence. Is there any indication? So you've studied them a lot. You've been with the same group of elephants a lot, I would presume, and you said they were very well habituated to humans. Is there any indication that, when you guys show up, they're like, oh, hey, Michael and the crew are here?
I never saw anything that to me was obvious, like they were reacting to our presence,
Mhm.
which is a good thing. We don't really
Yeah.
want them to or by our presence. But yeah, I mean, there's so many rumbles that they make. We have no idea what those rumbles are about. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
possible that some of it was related to us, but hopefully not too much
Yeah.
of it.
So I would imagine it. So you guys are playing it low key on purpose so that you are disturbing them as little as possible and therefore
Right.
seeing natural behavior.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. So you're
Yeah.
just sort of like, it's like if like a gazelle is walking by or a little bird, you just want to be like this fly on the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
When's the last time you were there?
Last time I was there was in, I think, March of 2023. So it's been almost 2 years, or probably about 2 years at this point.
Mm-hmm. And how many times have you been out there? Like dozens of times, just a few times?
Well, I more stayed out there for large blocks of time. So I spent a total of about 14 months in Kenya. And that was mostly broken up into two field seasons. So I had one of about 4 months and one of about 10 months.
Yeah. Yeah. And how did you even how did you even get into this? This is a pretty unique. There's not a lot of probably elephant field researchers that do anything like this.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I think I got lucky. Basically, I really wanted so I originally, when I started my PhD, I started working with Asian elephants, and I found a project that somebody else had started, and I started collaborating with them, and I did some field work with Asian elephants, but that I ended up not continuing that project, mostly for logistical challenges. I just felt like I wasn't able to get the data that I needed with the resources that I had. So I ended up switching to a different species for my PhD, finished my PhD on that, and then I really wanted to go and do a postdoc with elephants and go back to working with elephants. So I applied for an NSF postdoctoral fellowship, and wrote a research grant proposal specifically to do this study on names in elephants, and it got funded. So that's so then I went to Colorado State University, and I did a postdoc on elephants there.
What are there any other species? I mean, you mentioned dolphins earlier.
Mm-hmm.
What are the species where we think something like name calling or this sort of like individual intentional type of vocal learning is happening?
So the species where we currently have evidence for it is bottlenose dolphins, and to a lesser extent, many other dolphins that we know they make signature whistles, although it hasn't been necessarily demonstrated that those dolphins use signature whistles as a way to address other individuals, but they probably do. So probably multiple species of dolphins, multiple species of parrots, African savanna elephants, and common marmosets.
I see.
Those are the only ones that we actually have empirical evidence for this in currently.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be surprised if they were the only species that had this behavior.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of other animals that have pretty sophisticated vocal learning abilities, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of those also had similar behavior.
I don't know if you've thought about this specifically, but in the realm of the questions around human language evolution, one of the big questions is, when it actually arose. Yeah. And the two basic schools of thought are that, on one side of the spectrum is it might be quite recent. Certainly under 1 million years old, even under 500,000 years old, potentially just tens of thousands of years old, that it's, this quite recent, very recent thing that's, kind of really special in that sense and unique to humans. I guess another point of view is that language didn't really pop out of nowhere all at once or anything even close to that. It probably gradually was bootstrapped by increasingly sophisticated forms of non-language and language-like vocal communication.
Yeah.
Potentially even, 1 million or 2 years ago, there could have been more archaic species of Homo using something that was language or at least like a proto-language. Has your comparative study of other species given you a particular perspective on human language evolution and sort of which of those two molds might be more likely?
Yeah, I tend to favor the second view, that it's not just a single trait that popped up fully formed, but rather that it's a gradual trait that evolved over time and got increasingly complex over a longer period of time. And the reason why I think that is because there's evidence for a lot of language-like features in non-human species. So, for example, there's evidence of simple grammatical rules in some species of monkeys and birds. There's these, name-like calls in elephants and dolphins and parrots. Obviously, some of these instances are going to be independent origins, especially for mammals and birds that are very evolutionarily divergent, relatively speaking. But the fact that they occur in so many species, including some primates, suggests to me that these language is not something that just arose all at once. I think my specific research on elephants, it doesn't tell us much about when human language arose, because humans and elephants are basically as divergent as is possible for placental mammals to be, right? Like, we're separated by like 90 to 100 million years of evolution. But one thing it can potentially give us some insight into is the selection pressures that may have led to the development of language-like abilities. That, there's something that in the ecology of elephants and humans and parrots and dolphins that all, and marmosets, that all cause them to evolve this ability to address specific individuals. And maybe if we can identify what that is, we can get some insight into like what the early environment of humans that cause them, of human ancestors that cause them to develop language might look like.
And I mean, clearly social structure, complex social behavior, and having a sophisticated social structure is key here. But do we know anything more specific than that? So like, if we consider sort of the full pool of social mammals out there, mammals and birds, let's say, are there particular types of social animals with certain types of social structures that tend to be more likely to have the more sophisticated forms of communication? Is there, what do we know there?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure if there is, or at least if there is, I don't know if anybody has empirically identified it. It's kind of weird because we see some of these highly complex language-like systems of communication in species that you wouldn't necessarily think have like the most complex social structure. Like, a great example is Japanese tits. So Japanese tits have they make alarm calls where it's been shown that individuals perceive the alarm calls as meaningful utterances. It's not just like a stimulus response. They react to it by fleeing. They act like, when they hear a snake alarm call, they actually picture a snake and are more primed to respond to snake-like objects. They have simple grammatical rules in how they combine calls together, and they'll combine different calls into a phrase. The phrase has to be in a specific order, and it has a new meaning that's kind of a composite of the meanings of the two calls that are combined. And I think this is just me speculating here, so take this with a grain of salt, but I think that it may be that some of these features are more common than we realize. And the reason why we see them in animals that don't necessarily seem like they have the most complex social structure is because those are the animals where people have chosen to study these things.
I see. We're most attracted to the social animals because it probably reminds us of us and other things like that. And therefore we study them more and notice these things more.
Right. But like for example, with the Japanese tits, I think the reason we know all this about Japanese tits is because a researcher named Toshitaka Suzuki has studied them for many years, and he's interested in these questions about language evolution. So he's investigated them in the tits, and then it turns out, lo and behold, they have these abilities.
Right.
But, I don't think anybody's ever studied that in many species. So maybe these abilities are a little bit more widespread than we realize. And it's just that nobody's studied them in a lot of species.
So there's sort of a sampling bias and a research bias that makes it look like complex social structure might be necessary to develop these sorts of traits, but that might not be the case at all.
Potentially, yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously Japanese tits are, highly social birds, but
they don't have.
I'm not aware of anything that's like uniquely complex about their social structure.
Yeah. Interesting.
I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on Japanese tits.
Yeah. And so many of these things are tough because like to really, so many of these behaviors you sort of have to observe in the field. Like you can bring animals into the lab, but it completely sort of takes them out of the context in which these traits evolve, and therefore sort of it attenuates the expression of different behaviors. And so, and obviously field work is tough to do. You got to go out to the field, you got to fund it somehow. You've got to spend hours and hours to even have the chance to see something if it's there. So the potential for not seeing things that are there is actually quite high.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's sort of the challenge, but also the joy of field work, that you're observing animals in their natural environment, and so it's in an ecologically and evolutionarily relevant context. And sometimes you get to see things and appreciate them in a way that you really wouldn't if you were observing them in a much more controlled environment.
Yeah, yeah. So what are you working on now?
So now I'm actually branching out into something a little bit different. So I'm using bioacoustics in a more applied way as a tool to study population ecology and conservation. So what I'd like to do long term is kind of combine those two. I'd like to continue working on these interesting questions about language evolution and communication in elephants and other animals. But also I want to have a more applied focus to my work, where I'm actually like hopefully doing something useful in the world, and helping us preserve biodiversity by basically using bioacoustics as a tool to monitor wild animal populations.
We've covered a lot. We focused mostly on elephants, but I mean, is there anything you want to reiterate, or any final thoughts you want to leave people with about vocal communication and social cognition in general, in terms of other species?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like in terms of broad general statements, I think I think we need to not underestimate how widespread some of these traits may be, and we shouldn't exclusively focus on studying like the big charismatic species like elephants and whales and chimpanzees, right? There's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in the species that often get overlooked, like Japanese tits, for example, or domestic chickens, right? Like chickens actually have a remarkably complex vocal communication system that's really fascinating, and is often quite cognitively complex as well, or at least it seems to be. And so I think by studying like a wider range of species, we get a better appreciation for how widespread these traits are, and then that can be really useful, from the perspective of evolutionary biology. If we want to understand how these evolved, we really need to understand how widespread they are. We need to know not only which species have these traits, but also which species don't. So I think we should not underestimate species just because we don't canonically think of them as particularly complex or intelligent, because we may be surprised.
Yeah. And where can people find your stuff and read your work if they're interested?
So I have a YouTube channel. It's just I just recently started posting on it regularly, so it's just getting off the ground. It's called Inside Animal Minds. I also have an Instagram page by the same name, Inside Animal Minds. So you can check me out on either of those places.
All right, Mickey, Pardo, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content.